Hi, and welcome back to Janine Crafts. Today I want to talk to you about what to do when mistakes happen, because they do happen. As with any craft or any hobby you partake in, you have to expect something to go wrong occasionally. So I'm going to talk to you about some things that I've had happen with me with counted cross stitch, and hopefully give you some tips on how to correct those mistakes and save you some frustration. First off, I'm going to show you with this design. One of the things that I forgot to do was to take care of the edges of my cloth all the way around. So what happened was, while I was stitching, you can see the fabric starts fraying, and there's a couple of ways that you can solve this this problem. The first is, if you're somebody that has a sewing machine and you sew, you can either take a simple zigzag stitch all the way around your cloth, and that will help to keep that fraying from happening. The second thing you can do, if you have a serger, is you can serge all the way around the edge. Now, I don't have a serger, and it was just too much trouble for me to get the sewing machine out, thread it up, get a bobbin going, and all that kind of stuff. In this particular design, I worked so quickly that I didn't really bother with it, because I did have a little bit of fraying, but it's not going to be anything that's going to affect my project when I frame it. So I didn't worry about it. Now, this project that I'm working on now is taking me a little longer to complete, so I did go ahead and take care of the edge of my fabric. And as you can see here, all I did was take some masking tape, and of course you want to use an acid-free masking tape, and it's about 3/4 of an inch wide, and so I just laid it down. I cut a length that would fit the length of my fabric, and then just folded it over in half. I laid it down, laid my fabric on top of it, and then folded the tape over to the other side, and I did that all the way around, and that kept me from having to worry about frayed edges. So that's one problem you may run into, and how to solve that problem. Second problem you may run into, and I don't know if you'll be able to see it on camera, but right here I got a little bit of a smudge, a dirty smudge on my fabric. And that can happen also. I mean, I do try to be very careful and make sure I'm working with clean hands so that I don't have any problems with getting any dirt or oil, just body oil or anything on my fabric. But in this case I did. So the way I work with that is, and again, you have a couple of options here depending on what the stain is. A lot of times you can take those shout wipes. They just come pre-packaged, individually packaged wipes, and sometimes you can just run that over the stain, and that'll take it right up if it's a very simple stain. Sometimes what I'll do is take a clean paper towel and spray something like a little spray and wash or shout on it, and again just wipe the spot clean. Now, if it's a stain that's not coming up simply like that, you may end up having to finish your design first, finish all your stitching, and when you're done, go ahead and put some cold water in a sink or in a small basin with some woolite. And you want to make sure your water's cold, because sometimes the dye on the embroidery floss is not set. In other words, it can bleed and it can run. So you definitely want to work with cold water. Another recommendation by the manufacturers is that you wash your thread first, so that if it's going to bleed at all, wash it before you start stitching. So if it's going to bleed at all, it'll do it before you start stitching, so if you have to wash your fabric later, you won't have to worry about the color bleeding. Now, I don't wash my thread first. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's just a little bit too much trouble to go through before stitching for me. But you can wash the fabric after your stitching's done. Again, you just want to use cold water and a very mild detergent like Woolite to do so. So that's how you would handle a problem like that. Okay, another problem that you can run into, if you can look here on this one, you can see that my G's are different. And what happens is getting your count off, or as I did, just simply placing, I just placed this one little quarter stitch in the wrong place, and that's what ended up throwing this entire G off. And sometimes that'll happen if you've counted off, like say from this W to this vine, and you counted one too many or one too few. You know that it's going to throw your whole design off, because it's going to be off from here, and then of course as I stitched all the way around, it would have been off all the way around, which, as you can see here, if these weren't lined up correctly and counted correctly, they wouldn't match up and be mirror images of each other as they should be. So what you do is, in this case, I had already done all of the cross stitching in the little in the letters, and when I realized my mistake was when I was doing the back stitching. And I could have gone ahead and ripped out the cross stitching in this G and redone it, and that would have been fine. As it was, I didn't feel like it looked really bad, and it wasn't going to cause me a problem to have my count off anywhere else, because I'd already done all of this lettering, and so it wasn't causing my count to be off, and it wasn't throwing the pattern off. But if you were to miscount and it was throwing your pattern off, you would have one of two options. You would either have to rip out the stitching and start over, not the entire pattern. You wouldn't have to rip out all the stitching, just from where your count was off. You would either have to rip out the stitching and start over from there, or adjust your count. Like say in this situation, if I had say counted, there's supposed to be 4 squares in between, say this leaf and this W, and I'd only counted 3, then what I could have done to correct the situation is, like say when I got into this area, I could have added an extra back stitch, and that would have brought the pattern back into alignment, and it wouldn't have been terribly obvious had I done it in a place like right here, or even a little bit further down and say right here. But when you get to be this close together and it's supposed to be a mirror image, then it would be very obvious if it was off a little bit. So that's my recommendation there, is either figure out a way to adjust your count somewhere else to bring the pattern back into alignment, or if you haven't gotten too terribly far, go ahead and take those stitches out and start over, because sometimes you can adjust it and it's not real obvious, but sometimes there's no way to adjust it. It's going to be obvious when you try to adjust it. And another thing I want to talk about, and this was just such a silly mistake, but it happens. You can see this design is being worked across the fabric this way, so it's going more horizontally across the fabric instead of this way, where you'd be working the design on the long side of the fabric. I'm sorry, I know I'm probably not explaining that well. See, this one is more this way across the fabric, whereas this one is the other way. Well, I had just completed this design, which was worked on the fabric in one direction, and I just started this one, and without thinking, instead of stitching it this way, I started stitching it across this way, and thank goodness I only had a couple of letters done before I realized my mistake. So the only thing I could do at that point was to unstitch everything, take it out, and start over in the proper direction, which was this way. And if you have to do that, particularly if in my situation you haven't gotten too far, it didn't waste so much thread that I'm going to run short, because these kits do come with extra thread, so that if you do have a mistake and you have to rip out stitches, you're not going to be short on thread. But if you are, most of the time you can go and purchase the color that you run short on at your hobby store, and the colors on the directions are numbered. Let me go ahead and show you that. I know I showed you this in a video already, but you do get the number that relates to the thread that you're using. So the medium green is going to be number 3363, and most of the time in the hobby store you will be able to just go and purchase that number, and it will be the right color for your design. Another problem you run into, and this was a mistake that I don't generally make, but it happens. As you can see, this little piece of tape that I have right here, When I started stitching, I had to change thread, and when I started stitching, I secured my thread under the other stitches as I normally do. But then I wasn't paying attention, and I pulled the string too tightly and pulled my anchoring out, and didn't realize it until I'd gotten I want to say I'd gotten quite a bit stitched before I realized that tail was not secure under other stitches. And at that point, the only option I would have had would have been to undo everything and then restitch it, making sure that was secure. And I decided not to do that because this is a much simpler solution. Again, you want to make sure you're using an acid-free tape, and you just cut it very, very small so that it can hide very easily behind your stitching, and just tape that tail down so now you don't have to worry about it coming loose. And where this would be a real problem would be when you're doing your framing, and sometimes when people frame their counted cross stitch, they use a very sticky board to hold it in place, and as you're having to pull your fabric away from that board to position it and move it, if you have loose threads like that, it can start giving you problems. So you do want to make sure that all of your tails are secure in some kind of way, whether it be behind other stitches or as I had to do here and tape it down. But like I said, again, very important, use acid-free tape, and you want to make sure that you cut the piece of tape small enough that it will hide behind your other stitches. But anyway, those are some problems that I've run into with counted cross stitch. If you have any other problems that you've run into and you need some advice, please feel free to leave me a message below and ask. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. And as always, thanks for watching. Have a great day.